The older we get, the more mature we become, or we think that we become. But we look back and see how we've grown in our life. And one of the areas that I've grown in my life is I understand more fully the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. And if we're honest, I think the church stresses the concept of peacekeeping. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to upset somebody else. We don't want to cause a disturbance. And so we just act like everything's okay. And while there are certain times where we just need to say, you know what, I don't need to get involved. Or I need to let this go and it's not a big deal. And there are a lot of times like that. But peacemaking is active. Peacekeeping is passive. I'm not going to engage or I'm going to ignore. Peacemaking is I'm going to be willing to risk having the hard conversations so we can have legitimate peace on the other side. Because if all we're doing is avoiding, then we're actually having false peace. We're not having legitimate peace. Peacemaking is stepping into the tension, the difficulty, the disagreement, whatever it may be, so that the healing of Jesus can really shine through. Now, if we go into that situation, guns a blazing, and trying to defeat the other person, that's not peacemaking either, right? That's just trying to win. And winning is not making peace. But Jesus came for peace. And one of his titles is the Prince of Peace that we find in Isaiah chapter 9. It says, "For unto us a child is given, a son is born, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with justice and fairness from the throne of his ancestor David for all of eternity. And the passionate commitment of the Lord of Heaven's army will make this happen." Right? Jesus is the Prince of Peace. We've worked through the other three of those, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and the wonderful Counselor. And today we're going to look at Jesus as the Prince of Peace. But as I've said, sometimes we focus so much on the nativity scene that we forget that Jesus displays this throughout his ministry. And so we're going to look at Luke chapter 7 and 19 today to look at how Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Now when we think of monarchies, particularly in the ancient world, but even today, the king or the monarch was responsible for the social order and economic prosperity of their country, trying to protect the individuals that are in their kingdom, which meant that international relationships were crucial to maintain peace. But the irony is that for the king to seek peace, that person wasn't usually remembered. The one who was remembered is the one who was successful for their wars and expansion campaigns. And so even though peace was an essential responsibility for the king was only remembered if they defeated other people in war, if they subdued another country, or they protected themselves from another. But Jesus came for something different. And so we're going to look at a story that you probably didn't anticipate in Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. It says, one of the Pharisees came to Jesus and invited him to dinner. So Jesus went over to his house and sat down to eat. When a certain immoral woman from that city learned that Jesus was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. She knelt at Jesus' feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them with her hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he thought to himself, if he were really a prophet, if Jesus were really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She is a sinner. Jesus answered his thoughts by saying to the Pharisee, Simon, I have something to tell you. And Simon replied, go on, teacher. And then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one and 50 pieces of silver to the other. But neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave the loan, canceling their debts. Who do you suppose loved the man more after that? And Simon replied, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. That's right, Jesus said. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your house, you did not offer me water to wash the dust from my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not greet me with a kiss, but she has not stopped kissing my feet since I first arrived. You neglected the courtesy of giving me olive oil to anoint my head, but she has anointed my feet with rare perfume. I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown me much love. But a person who is forgiven little only loves little. Then Jesus said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. The men sitting around the table said among themselves, who is this man who goes on forgiving sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, the text describes the woman as a certain immoral woman. She was a prostitute. That's what it's meaning. That's what it's implying. That's who she is. She is not someone that you wanted to associate with. That's the reality of. She had a reputation, and everyone seemed to know it. Now, regardless of if it's like this person or not, we've gone through life like this. That there are people like, oh, I don't know if we should associate with that person. We've been there. So let's make sure we don't condemn the Pharisee and the religious leaders, because we all have those judgmental, at least temptations, to do the same thing. But it was customary at this time for the host to offer water for the person to wash their feet. In fact, in a lot of places, you would have expected the Pharisee to either wash Jesus' feet or have someone in his household wash Jesus' feet. Washing the feet was not something anybody wanted to do. It was reserved for the lowest person of the household, but the Pharisee didn't even offer Jesus water for him to do it himself. Now, this was a customary thing. They walked around in sandals all day, so their feet were dirty. Now, the house was a dirt floor house, so it's not as though he had to wipe his feet before he got into the house. It had nothing to do with making sure the house stayed clean. It was a ceremonial thing that they did to clean themselves. Now, the religious leaders at Jesus' time and into the Old Testament emphasized a lot about religious purification, of trying to remain pure. And many of the Old Testament laws, some are purification for hygiene purposes or infectious purposes. Others are for sinful purposes, of we remain clean because we don't want to be contaminated by sin. And sometimes the hygiene laws were to remind us of our spiritual purification that we needed to maintain at the same time. But some of those laws in the Old Testament is that if you came in contact with someone who was considered unclean, you also would be considered unclean. Now, from a hygiene perspective, if I touch somebody with an infectious skin disease, like just touch them on the arm, then I need to go through a purification process to make sure the infection doesn't spread. We all get that. So in some ways, the Old Testament was ahead of its time from spreading diseases. But with Jesus coming in contact with this woman, this immoral woman, he would be considered unclean. And the religious leaders like, we don't associate with people like that. Now, the great thing about Jesus is that he can interact anywhere and not be contaminated. Jesus is holy and clean and pure and righteous. Nothing can contaminate Jesus. And so even though the religious leaders claim his thought was completely unfounded, we can at least understand where he's coming from the system in which he was brought up. See, but the problem, that's what's happening here, is that with the Pharisee, is that the law became more important than relationships. It became more important that the Pharisee remained pure than he engaged in others to help them get closer to God. That's an issue. I think we can all, when we break it down like that, we can understand why that is an issue. But to explain it, Jesus gave the illustration of debt and debt forgiveness, and debt can be crushing. If you have a lot of debt right now, it probably consumes a lot of your thoughts. Now, some of our debts, like if we have a mortgage payment, right? We know it's a long 30-year process. We don't like it, but it's pretty consistent, usually lower rates. But if you've got a lot of credit card debt and all you can do is pay the minimum payment, it seems hopeless. Right? Debt holds us down. It holds us back. It squeezes the life out of us. So Jesus is using the debt of money to show the debt of our spiritual lives. See, the woman's debt, from a society standpoint, is greater than the Pharisee's debt in his spiritual life. And so Jesus compares and contrasts him. Now the problem, I think we also need to make sure we recognize, is that no one can pay their debt of sin. You are unable to pay your debt of sin. Now we could say that the woman was a greater sinner than the Pharisee. That may be true, but the Pharisee still could not pay his debt of sin. No matter how good you become, no matter how moral you live, no matter how religious you get from following a list of rules, you cannot save yourself. We are all in a debt of sin that we are unable to pay. But in this moment, the woman washed Jesus' feet, and she showed humility. And I just put in my notes, it's going to be on the screen, of she had no shame. And she probably had shame, but what I mean from that is she had nothing to lose. She knew her reputation. She probably knew what people thought of her. She probably knew what the Pharisee thought of her. But she said, I've got nothing to lose. I can't get any lower. I'm going to wash Jesus' feet. And she cried and she wept. She wiped his feet with her hair. She had nothing really to offer except she brought the expensive perfume. We don't know her backstory. We don't know how she acquired this. But in most cases, somebody in her life setting would have had very few material possessions, would not have been well off at all. So this perfume represents a significant amount of her assets, of her financial assets. And she was willing to pour this perfume on Jesus' feet. She was willing to sacrifice her worldly well-being for Jesus. That's part of what Jesus is getting at here of she was forgiven a lot. Her sins seemed greater than the Pharisee, and because of that, she was able to sacrifice more than the Pharisee. Now, the Pharisee could have sacrificed just as much, but the inclination is different from the different people. But Jesus forgives the woman. And this is the good news, that Jesus forgives freely. No matter who you are, what you're going through, what your past has been, Jesus forgives freely. Jesus is not stingy in his forgiveness. When we come to Jesus with humility and sincerity, he will forgive us. Now notice, we don't have a complete manuscript of a transcript of what happened in this interaction. It's not like there was a stenographer at the meal recording every word that was said. So we don't know all the interactions, but Jesus says the woman is forgiven. Now, she didn't say the sinner's prayer. She didn't say construct the right sentence in order to receive forgiveness, but she did show her heart, that she had a contrite heart. Now, we have to be careful here, because just because you're around Jesus things doesn't mean you're right with Jesus. Just because you're close to Jesus things doesn't mean you're right with Jesus. Just because you think, oh, I like the idea of Jesus, doesn't mean you're right with Jesus. We actually have to come to Jesus. We have to have a moment where we come to Jesus. You just don't you don't just morph into Jesus. It's a decision that you make in a moment to say, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to give myself to Jesus. I'm going to do this. Now, then you make that decision every moment, every day. It's not like, well, I made the decision 37 years ago, so now I'm just coasting. Now, we can say, I've settled the question. That's an old-time phrase, that I'm going to follow Jesus. But then I reaffirm that question every day. I continually follow Jesus. She had a contrite heart. She came to Jesus with sincerity and humility, and Jesus provides forgiveness. And what Jesus does is Jesus is able to transform our situations. I don't know what you're going through, but I'm guessing a good number of you have some heavy things going on in your life. Jesus can transform those things. Jesus can change them dramatically and radically. And sometimes Jesus changes things slowly, like you're turning a big ship. Sometimes he changes it in an instant, and it's overwhelming. But Jesus can transform our situations, which brings us to the concept of peace. We can have peace regardless of our circumstances because we trust in Jesus. Peace is not circumstantial. You may have some really big things happening in your life. You may have a lot of confusion, a lot of heartache, or frustration. You may have some of those things, but Jesus can provide peace because we are not trusting in the worldly things. We're trusting in the one who saves us. That's what peace brings us. That's how we can have peace, because peace is trusting in Jesus. And the woman goes in peace. Or he tells her that she can go in peace. Now, I have in my notes here that Jesus is the way to peace, not perfection. And maybe I should say Jesus is the way to peace before perfection. Because, eventually Jesus is going to make everything right. We're going to be good. We're going to have no more crying there, no more sin, no more suffering. But I think sometimes we get it reversed of we have to be perfect before we can have peace. We have to act the part before Jesus accepts us. That is not true. You don't have to get clean before you come to Jesus. Jesus says, come to me as you are, and I will give you peace. And what Jesus does in our life transforms us and shapes us into who he has called us to be. Because you can look around and you can always find someone who's better than you are. And that's awfully discouraging. You can always find somebody who's worse than you too, and that's the other side of the argument or conversation. But Jesus is the way to peace. And when we allow him into our life to have this peace, then it transforms all of our situations. I do wonder how many times we've asked ourselves, is peace actually possible? Because sometimes it seems like it's not. Like with all the chaos, all the noise, all of this, how is it possible? Now, from a society standpoint, peace starts with protecting the vulnerable. We're making sure people aren't getting taken advantage of. If only the elite or the top of the top are able to get justice, that's a problem. Peace starts with making sure those who can't defend themselves are not taken advantage of. See, what Jesus is telling us is that we can have peace because of what he does for us. Peace is not just because the winner is ruling. That's how the world works, right? When two countries go at war and one country defeats the other, there is peace because the country that wins now sets the rules. That's not the peace that Jesus is providing us. Jesus is providing peace that's greater and deeper than that. But we see throughout Scripture how many people are seeking something. And we're all seeking something. Everybody who is alive is seeking something. And sometimes we find things that seem to satisfy us, but until we find Jesus, we're actually not going to find the thing that does satisfy. We're going to find things that have holes, that are lacking, that are missing. Only Jesus satisfies. And so we see in Matthew chapter 2, where the wise men are coming to seeking this newborn king of the Jews. And they go to Jerusalem, the capital city, because that's where they think Jesus, the newborn king of the Jews, should be. But he's not there. And they find him in Bethlehem, and we know the story, that they give him gifts of gold, of frankincense, and myrrh. And we're kind of like, those are some weird things. We get gold. Gold makes sense. But frankincense and myrrh aren't things we think of very often today. Those aren't words we use unless we're talking about the Christmas story. Well, frankincense is incense which was used in worship ceremonies. And so it was about worship. Myrrh was used, had some medicinal qualities, but it was also used for burial and embalming purposes. Then we have gold, which is fit for a king, and we see that's a precious metal of value. And so Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, we see these gifts the wise men bring, and it foreshadows who Jesus is, that he is worthy of our worship. He is a king, but he is coming to die, that he is leading to death. And so that is who this Jesus is that we are seeking. Sometimes we need to be reminded of these types of things. You probably know the Christmas story or some version of it. But faith is like a muscle, and that we have to use it in order to maintain it, let alone grow it. If we're not using our muscles, they are going to weaken and get less. We have to work out. We have to exercise in order for our muscles to maintain and grow. But it's hard work, and it requires consistent work. You know, going to church once a week for an hour is not building your faith muscles. If all you do is eat healthy one meal a week, is that really going to change your physical health? Probably not. It's not bad to do that, but it's not enough. We need to work out our faith muscles consistently, every day, seeking Jesus. Because if we don't, we may run into the fate that Jesus encounters in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44, where he's coming into Jerusalem, and as he gets closer to the city, he begins to weep. He says, "How I wish today that you, of all people, would understand the way to peace, but now it is too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and enclose you in from every side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you." Jesus is grieving over Jerusalem, the holy city, the place where the center of everything, the place where the temple is, where God dwells. And Jesus is grieving over it because they no longer have peace. What happened is they chose to reject God. And because of that, God's peace was removed. Not because God withdrew it, but because they rejected it. It was a sign of how hard the hearts of the people had become. They had pushed God away so much. They may have been following religious rituals, but they weren't actually receiving God into their life. They were choosing their own path. And when we choose our own path, it becomes the path of destruction. That if I choose my way instead of God's way, then I'm choosing to go towards destruction. Now that seems real dismal, and it can be. But see, the reality is God has a plan for me, and I can either accept that plan or reject it. This is the intense call of the gospel. I either choose Jesus or I don't. And if I try to choose Jesus and something else, that's me not choosing Jesus. It's either only Jesus or not Jesus. Those are the two options. And so if we really want peace, we have to choose Jesus. But oftentimes, we mistake peace and victory as synonymous or as they're connected. We can have peace because we won. One country has peace over another because it defeated that country, and so now it sets the rules, so it has peace. When we have relationships, just because you win the argument doesn't mean there's actual peace. That's not the goal of what Jesus is calling us to. He's not calling you to be a winner, to beat somebody else, because the reality is Jesus has brought victory, but his victory was not because he had a bigger stick than the other guy, because he had a bigger gun than the other guy. It's because he laid his life down. That's how Jesus brings victory to us, by laying his life down for us. See, violence does not precede the peace that Jesus provides. The rules of our world is that violence precedes peace. We've got conflict, and in order to resolve the conflict, we have to have violence, and once that violence is over, we have peace because one side wins. But Jesus does not bring violence in order to achieve peace. Jesus receives violence in order to receive peace. He received the violence of the cross and all the pain and suffering that came with that. He received that violence so that we could have peace. That's radical news. That is not how the world works, but it's how Jesus calls us to live. He received the violence so we could have peace. Now we can talk about how was the violence in Jesus' day compared to our day, from the sense of there's more accountability today when things happen. The news is spread, but now we get fake news and AI-generated stuff, and now it's really a mess. But the ancient world was ruthless. Was one better than the other? We can debate that, I guess. But oftentimes what we find with leaders, particularly in the ancient world and even today, is leaders are loyal to their self. They're loyal to themselves. And we find this in King Herod in Matthew 2, after the wise men visit him. King Herod wanted just to protect himself. He was only loyal to himself. Now, he was an extremely diverse person. He had all sorts of connections. Politically, he was a Roman. Ethnically, he was an Arab. Religiously, he was a Jew, but culturally, he was a Greek. He had all these places that he could pick from in order to maneuver this world. And in many ways, Herod was extremely successful and revered. He was also hated because he was a terrible person. He didn't care who got in the way. He would destroy whatever obstacle there was, killing countless people. But we find that Herod had divided loyalties. Now, he was very skilled, so he was able to use those different loyalties to his advantage. But he was a divided person. And I wonder how many people try to do that with Jesus. We have divided loyalties. And so we try to maneuver this world, keeping Jesus and all these other things as well. But if we do that, we're really not choosing Jesus. Jesus tells us we cannot have divided loyalties. We have to reject everything in this world except Jesus and allow Jesus to be the foundation of who we are. Now, it's interesting when we look at King Herod, and we can draw King Herod's lineage as his back to the Edomites. If you remember, the Edomites were descendants of Esau. So a little history lesson here. We have Abraham. Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac had twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Jacob, later name was changed to Israel. We get the nation of Israel, and all of the Jews are descended from Israel. Well, Esau, his descendants were in tension and conflict with the descendants of Jacob. And so we see with Jesus, who was in the line of David, we see that Jesus is now showing the conflict between Esau and Jacob yet again. But as we always see, God's chosen people end up the winners in this, but that's not because Jesus has better tactics or better weapons or better followers, but because Jesus receives the violence and upends this world. But see, if I live like Herod, if I rule my own life, if I'm only loyal to myself, then I'm saying, Jesus, I don't need you. Or maybe I'm viewing Jesus as my lucky rabbit's foot. I'm viewing Jesus as the thing that helped my odds turn out a little bit better. See, I can be extremely moral and contrary to Jesus. Just because I don't follow Jesus doesn't mean I'm a morally bad person. And if I have divided loyalties, I can still be a morally good person. So this is not talking about people who are just terrible people. They could be terrible people, but they're not necessarily terrible people in society. But in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus makes a statement that I find is difficult to digest. He says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, don't imagine that I came to bring peace on earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. But isn't he the Prince of Peace? Didn't he tell the woman that her sins are forgiven, that her faith has saved her? Go in peace. Don't we have peace when we trust in the one who saves? We do. But Jesus came not to bring peace, but a sword? That can be difficult to digest, because what Jesus calls us to do is he says we cannot have divided loyalties. Jesus' purpose is not to affirm you, not to affirm your life, not to affirm your choices. The goal of Jesus is not to make you feel all warm and fuzzy about yourself. That's hard for us, because that's what society says we should be doing. Jesus came to save you and call you to a new life. Jesus does not condemn you for the sinful choices you are making, but he does say, leave your life of sin. Your sins are forgiven. Go in peace, but don't stay in that sin. That is where the sword of Jesus comes in. That he says, I'm going to divide all of your other things from me. We're going to cut the sin out of your life. We're going to destroy it and sever it from you so it no longer can live. Because Jesus is confrontational. He says, you either choose me or you don't. Now, confrontational sometimes has a negative connotation. Like, if I go up to confront someone, usually that's not a positive, lighthearted thing. But Jesus is confrontational. It's not super lighthearted, but it's not judgmental either. Jesus is not confrontational in a way that condemns us. He's confrontational in a way that invites us to a new life. He says, you can choose me. You can choose your sin. You can choose the things that are contrary to Jesus, or you can choose Jesus and to be free from that. See, the peace that Jesus provides and offers, it's dangerous, it's subversive, and it contradicts the ways of this world. And I say it's dangerous and subversive because sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it calls you to make great risks. Sometimes it calls you to upset other people because they don't like the choices you're making for Jesus. You know, I've seen it before. I've seen people have radical life change and start making choices for Jesus, and it's upsetting other people. It's upsetting their old life, their old people in their old life. And some, they don't understand it. They're confused. They miss that old person, whoever that was. But Jesus calls us to a new life. Now, we can say Jesus is the new Caesar. That's the government structure in which Jesus was living. Jesus is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And he came so that he could receive the violence, which could then offer us peace. This is the new life that Jesus calls us to receive, the new life that he calls us to enter into. We can say he's the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And he is those things. But how has that changed your life? What has that done for you? How is your life different because of Jesus? See, the reality is, I'm not better than someone else because of Jesus, but I am better than I was because of Jesus. Right? And that's where we land. And when I am better in Jesus, more and more peace enters my life. I'm able to receive his peace that transcends all situations, recognizing that peace is no longer circumstantial because I have Jesus and I trust in the one who saves. So I wonder where you are in your relationship with Jesus. Do you have peace? Is Jesus just something you add on to your life? Are your loyalties divided like Herod, where you're trying your best to maneuver and and manipulate and get things in order so you can have happiness and balance? Or is your life peace because you've said, Jesus, I just want you. I don't have it figured out, but I'm going to come to you with humility and sincerity. And if you do that, then you're going to receive peace. But it's not just something we did 37 years ago. It's something we have to keep coming back to Jesus, saying, Jesus, I need your peace. Jesus, I'm committed to you. I don't have any other divided loyalties. If I do, search my heart, oh God. Convict me and change me. That's where we come to Jesus. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He provides peace that this world can't understand, which transforms our situations, our circumstances, and our future.